Welcome to everyone, especially to Dr. Manuel Orozco and to Nils. Nils, your last name? Jakob Rogil. Nils was yesterday, I'm sorry. Jakob Rogil from the Foreign Ministry, who will discuss Manuel's presentation. It's really a great pleasure to have this seminar today for several reasons. This is the first physical seminar after COVID I host, so that in itself is so exciting, having people in the auditorium and people talking physically to us. But apart from all you who are here, we have many participants online, because during the pandemic we have learned to broadcast online, and that means that we are 3 times as many people joining for this seminar. So that's really, really nice that so many people are interested in the topic of today's seminar on development and migration, root causes, and successful interventions. This seminar forms part of the migration seminar series at DIIS, but I should also say that it has come to be due to a collaboration with Café Directo, a coffee organization supporting Nicaraguan coffee farmers, who reached out to us. So thank you for doing that and making possible to invite Manuel Orozco to Copenhagen. And many of you will know that DIIS has a long tradition for making research and policy analysis on migration development links. We have worked on these issues for more than 20 years. And when we started out, Manuel Orozco was actually a great inspiration for our work. We read his work, and a couple of years later invited Manuel to participate in some of our events and publications. So this is also a reunion of sorts, which is really nice. And much has happened in this field over this period of time, of which we will hear more during Manuel Orozco's talk. As most of you have probably read in the invitation, Manuel is the director of the Inter-American Dialogue's Migration, Remittances and Development Program. It is based in Washington, and he also serves as a senior fellow at Howard University Center for International Development and is a senior advisor with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And he has conducted extensive research, made policy analysis, advocacy on various issues relating to global flows of remittances, as well as on migration and development in Latin America, Central America and the Caribbean, but also worldwide. He is the chair of Central America and the Caribbean at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute and a senior researcher at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University also. Manuel has published widely on these issues, and I would, for those of you who do not know his publication, urge you to find them. Many are online. And can also be found on the Inter-American Dialogue's webpage. So during today's talk, Manuel Orozco will focus on the role of development interventions in tackling the root causes of migration. Using the case of Guatemala, the presentation will explain how, on the one hand, financial inclusion efforts among remittance recipients has increased wealth in these communities and in the local economy, while this inclusion, on the other hand, simultaneously had reduced incentives to migrate. That sounds like a great win-win, right? And I trust that Dr. Orozco's broad geographical knowledge on remittance dynamics beyond the Central American region will allow us to have more global discussions on these issues, because as many of you know, Danish Development Corporation is no longer focused on Latin America, but mostly on Africa. So we can draw in these experiences as well. And to perhaps enlighten us a bit on this, but primarily to comment on Manuel Orozco's talk, we have invited Jakob Rokil Jakobsen, who is the chief advisor from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to start the discussion and comment on what we've heard. After that, I will try to conduct a democratic discussion where everybody who has something to say, comment, or maybe ask questions are welcome to join us. We aim to stop around 4 o'clock. Should we go a little longer, that's fine. But as we are live streaming, I will have to ask you to, when we start the discussion session, to only speak through a microphone, because otherwise our audience not present here will not be able to hear what you say. And it would be nice also if you start by mentioning your name. But without further ado, I will give the chair to Manuel Orozco. It's a pleasure.
Anyone is fine. I can sit over here. Well, thank you very much, Nina, for the invitation, and for my colleagues from CAFE who invited me to come and talk a little bit about Nicaragua and Nicaraguan politics, and good to be here after 15 years or something like that of sharing some of this work relating to migration and development. What I'm going to do is share some of the experiences we have had in several countries in Latin America, particularly in some countries in Central America, though a lot of this is actually based off cumulative knowledge and experience and practices on economic development strategies that connect to migration in different countries, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, Africa, and also some Latin American countries. So while I use the case of Guatemala as an example, there are actually specific experiences in several countries, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, for example, but also in other places like Bangladesh and the Philippines. But perhaps the point of departure to this is the global pandemic, and is that during the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty as to the future of migration and human mobility. After 3 months of airport closings, people were wondering if we were going to go into something else, not go back to something that we already had experienced. There was a lot of anxiety as to what was going to happen to labor mobility in particular, in the context where the global economy has increasingly relied on labor migration. And we have labor migration basically taking place from two main levels, like a U-curve, high-skilled and low-skilled migration. When we looked at the entire global economy, where there are over 100,000 global transnational corporations, 20% of whose labor is basically foreign workers, you see a significant number of people of high-skilled labor working all over the world. And then we have the other side, Bangladeshi workers working in the Gulf countries, Latin American migrants working in the United States, and so on. And Armenians working in Russia. So there were a lot of questions. So we started modeling, looking into, what can we project as to the future of migration in that context. And when we were thinking about that, one of these, perhaps the single most important issue that we'll come across looking at data for the past 20 years was the economic aspect, to the extent to which one important correlate of migration is continuously the size of the underperforming of an economy in the developing countries. We looked at other factors, state fragility in particular, which is perhaps one of the most important factors of migration since the 2009 global economic recession. State fragility manifested in different ways, but one of them fundamentally is economic fragility, and particularly in terms of the informal economies. I've been working on developing countries for nearly 40 years, and my first academic work was on the informal economy in 1984. And that was when the Hernando de Soto, this Latin American, this Peruvian author, wrote about a book called The Other Path, and referring to the informal economy all over the world, particularly in Peru. And 40 years later, we're still dealing with high informal labor forces and informal businesses. In any case, the reality turns out, when we try to make these projections, I found that depending on which regions you were looking at, there was between 6 and 12% migration growth projected for 2021. What we found out, at least in Latin America, is that in the middle of a pandemic, there were nearly more than 2 million people leaving their home countries. More than 2 million people. Just to the United States, we had 2 million people trying to get out of their home countries from different nationalities: Costa Rica, Cuba, Ecuador. I mean, the size of people's getting out of Ecuador was relative to 2019, 500% increase in the number of people who had left their home countries. Venezuelan migration, which was known to happen in other South American countries, increased also significantly in over 100,000 people. Then we had Nicaragua, a country that in 2019 only had less than 4,000 people going to the United States. It went up to 90,000 in 2021. Huge migration flows from different countries taking place, including from what we call the usual suspects: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which were countries that had already experienced a large migration wave in 2019. And we tried to understand, is this, I was trying to call this vaccine migration, because there seemed to be correlation between migration and low vaccination rates. Countries like Haiti, for example, were increasingly having people getting out. Ecuador, Nicaragua, with Nicaragua and Haiti in Latin America and the Caribbean only had until December of last year less than 20% of its population vaccinated with one dose. But the reality was a little bit more complex like that. And when we looked at the Central American countries, which is a region that had already a significant outflow of people, in 2021, the number of people who left, who only were caught trying to enter the border between Mexico and the United States, was nearly 1 million people. And that was a significant number. Total migration basically is 95% irregular from Central America to their home countries. The reality is, however, that with the exception of Nicaragua, only a portion of those people who actually, less than 40% of the people who actually tried to cross the border made it to the United States. But the cost of getting out is significantly expensive. On average, an immigrant from Guatemala, El Salvador, or Honduras spends $4,000 to $5,000 to get out. So imagine the costs of spending that money and then being returned in the middle of a pandemic, not just in a regular time period. And so the wave was significant. I mean, it was in the middle of this pandemic, you had a huge wave of migration. In 2019, we had already seen a huge number of people. This was the Trump era migration. When Donald Trump said he was going to close the border, he used the bad hombres, the bad men, were not going to be allowed to come in. Well, nearly 1 million people tried to make it, paradoxically, 70% of those people actually got through the US border. But that's a different story, politics aside. Interestingly enough, 2 million people tried to come in to the United States in 2021, and you can see the huge wave. So what did that, how did we come to explain that? So we looked at different things, in particular, the intention to migrate. I've been working in several of these countries since 2014, when there was a huge out-migration wave of kids, of minors. In 2014, 70,000 unaccompanied minors had left Central American countries to come to the United States, to go to the United States. And there were more kids getting out, minors getting out of Central America than the annual matriculation rate in those countries. So, I mean, this was really a huge migration crisis. Not only adults were getting out, but also minors. And people tried to come up with different conclusions. And it has been a difficult trip, you know. But we have found a couple of things. One is that predominantly both aspirations and material circumstances have come to play a fundamental role in the decision to migrate. And it's not just one particular experience, but the economics of day-to-day life eventually are the key triggers that make people's decisions to migrate. And you know, sometimes people take 6 months to make up their mind. We're still trying to figure out when is that, you know, the moment when you start thinking about migrating and you actually decide that in 2 weeks I'm leaving. But the interesting thing is that during the pandemic, well, people lost their jobs, but in particular, the most significant finding was that, even though it was a little intuitive, was the fact that those who were basically in the informal economy were the most affected by the pandemic, because you lost income. The people who work in the informal economy don't have a problem of employment. They are employed, but they just don't make enough money. Their incomes are typically under $200 a month. So they were the most affected. They basically, even in per capita income terms, Central Americans lost their incomes to 2017 levels. So this income loss came to have a major effect in their day-to-day lives in the middle of a pandemic. And in these countries, the healthcare rate, the support networks by the state were very low. Less than 20% of Central Americans actually have access to universal healthcare services, even though the law says that everyone has access. The reality is that a country like Guatemala has 10 hospitals in a country of 16 million people. And they cannot serve on real time, on one day, more than 10,000 people at a time. So when the pandemic hit Guatemala, it was disastrous. I mean, the contagion rate was huge. And considering the fact too that, you know, the contagion rate was directly correlated to international tourism rates. And Guatemala is one of the major tourist hosts in the world. The contagion rate is parallel in Guatemala and in Honduras in significant numbers the first 6 months. So all of that context really affected people's capacity to earn income, because you had quarantining, so the street worker could not get out. And now, why is it so important to talk about those in the informal economy? One reason is because the low incomes. The second reason is that 2/3 to 75% of the labor force works in the informal economy. They don't contribute to the social security system. They do not enjoy any type of social protection, labor protection of any sorts. And so they live in a very vulnerable context. And typically, those in the informal economy make less than the average wage in the country. So what we found is that there were two fundamental elements present in this dynamic. One was working in the informal economy increased the intention to migrate. Receiving remittances also increased the intention to migrate, or receiving less money also increased the intention to migrate. And remittances here has been used more as a proxy for transnational ties, the links with the relatives back home. We looked also at the case of El Salvador, and the same trend was happening. And one of the issues that the United States, the current administration, the Biden administration had emphasized had to do with hope. They argued that Central Americans had lost hope for being in their countries, and that explained migration. Even though they didn't really have data and they were mostly speculating, there is an element of truth to the fact that basically this having a negative outlook of their home country's economy and the entire country was correlating to the intention to migrate. The more negative you saw the country, or the less positive you saw it, the more likely to migrate your intention was. And then we looked at another country that has had a different experience to what we call in Latin America the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. And that's the case of Nicaragua. Nicaragua has gone through its own terrible demons. It's a country whose basically stage of dictatorship is in really at its fullest. There is a criminalization of democracy in the country since 2018, and mass migration happened, and a huge economic crisis also took place around mid-2018. And basically, the aspirational issue and the economic condition were also factors that led to the intention to migrate. To the point that in December 2021, 56% of people in Nicaragua wanted to migrate. Of course, the conditions in Nicaragua are not comparable to what's happening in Guatemala and Honduras, although, with all due respect, the entire Central American region is fucked up. I mean, it's really in bad shape. And that explains why basically 2% of Central Americans left their country effectively in 2021. I mean, just imagine the magnitude of that migration. And 20% of those people were minors. This year, my conservative projection is that the migration rate will be slightly lower, but similar to last year. People will continue to migrate because the economic recovery is not robust enough. So the reason why the informal economy is very important is connected to development, and predominantly to the fact that the informal economy is basically not only one push factor of migration, but is directly connected to labor productivity. The highest the informal economy in one country it is, the lowest the productivity levels are, because people low income, but most importantly, people are working in saturated markets. Everybody sells the same stuff. So there is no competitiveness. There is not a true market economy. What you have is a mercantile system where everybody's selling the same things. Food, bad quality food, things like, this week I'm going to sell batteries for radios. The next week I'm going to sell wipers for a certain brand of cards, etc. And people just squander what they can do. So the problem is not that they don't have a job, it's that they have a very badly paid job. And so looking at that, and while the Biden administration was trying to come up with some solutions, based on a lot of the work we have been doing in several developing countries with regards to the intersection between migration and development, one of the key elements that I have found is that the flow of remittances has a direct effect on increasing disposable income. And in many developing countries, between 2 and 3 out of 10 households have a relative receiving remittances in at least 50 developing countries. From a place like Moldova, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan to Haiti. Haiti, it's way up. 40% of its economy receives remittances. So that's 70% of households in the entire country are dependent on remittances. But then you have other countries like Paraguay or Colombia, among other places, where there is a strong dependency on remittances. The interesting element to it is that remittances increase disposable income, but more importantly, as they do that, they also increase the savings rate of households. But most of those households are still saving the money informally. So the strategy that we developed was to formalize the savings of remittance recipients at economies of scale, talking to 100,000 people or so. And then once that savings were formalized, having the commitment of the banking and the credit union system to mobilize those savings into credit in competitive sectors of the local economies, but not in farming activities, but in sectors that we call it associated to the knowledge economy: tutoring services, education services, professional services, where we found out that actually there are people who have skills, but they are not fully developed and they are not really connected to the value chains of their local economies. So with that strategy, we had been doing some work in that regard. That basically the most illustrative case is the project we have done in Guatemala since 2010, basically. But it was raised to scale in 2016, and since then we've been working there at basically 4 main levels. It's called the opportunities in my community. The strategy is that you provide financial advising to remittance recipients in scale. In this case, 150,000 people, that's about 10% of all remittance recipient households. And you formalize their savings. We formalize about $10 million in savings. Those savings are actually put and matched into funding credit for what we call knowledge entrepreneurs. And the strategy, what it does is that it focuses in perhaps one of the most important markets in every country's economy, and that's education. See, after food and housing, what's the other thing that we spend money, that households spend money on in the majority of cases is education, your kids' education. And it's an important expenditure. And the problem has been that in the development field, we have assumed that low-income people or poor people do not spend money on education, but they do. And they do have a demand to have their kids improve their education. So we develop a business model that will basically even make it profitable to have offer tutoring services that will cost the equivalent to 2% of household income in Guatemala, in rural Guatemala, about $7 a month, to provide extracurricular education to kids. And the result of that was that you will basically improve academic achievement of kids, but at the same time develop a human capital base with greater skills to provide services to this population. And that was connected through the savings that were formalized. Now, one of the byproducts of that, well, one important component was to get the migrant associations in the United States to participate in these joint strategies, to also co-finance, but also to focus on what we call nostalgic trade. This is about 15 years ago, we developed this theory I call the 5 T's of integration into the global economy through migration: transfers of capital and money, telecommunication, tourism, nostalgic trade, and transportation. And that is For some countries, for example, for the Dominican Republic, 600,000 Dominicans visit their home country in a country that has a 3 million tourist population. And if we look at other countries, we'll see a similar trend. At least 20% of the total tourist population is actually native born, that they are expats living in other countries. And so they do spend money while they are there. They also, when they are in their host country, they consume products, stuff. Nicaraguans say they only buy beans that are produced in Nicaragua. Mexicans only buy Coca-Cola bottled in Mexico because they say that the sugar tastes better, it's real, it's not fake. And everyone has their own thing. South Africans import biltong from South Africa and so on. And people spend about $1,500 a year or about $120 a month buying this stuff, cheese, quesadillas, etc. A lot of those things. And they're prepared to spend money on that. And in any case, the strategy basically is it's mutually reinforcing. You formalize savings from remittance recipients, you mobilize them into credit, strengthen the entrepreneurial base that is there but is not strong enough to be competitive. And then we get the financial sector to invest in those segments. And that has been a lot of the experience we had developed in those countries. And at this point, what we're trying to do is convince the US government to really buy into it and invest the resources beyond the traditional approach. The traditional approach being continue supporting assistance only in farming activities, exporting coffee or producing bananas, when in fact we know that because that can give you a good job, it's not good enough to live in the modern society. Just to give you an example, in Latin America, and it actually in most countries, one of the most expensive things that you have at hand is data. Data costs 20 gigabytes of data, which is the average consumption, cost about $12 on average in a developing country. But $12 a month for a household that makes $200, it's basically prohibitively expensive. When you control for all the other expenditures, it's just terribly expensive. So you need to change the model of growth in order to focus in wealth generation in other activities that are outside of the traditional approaches. And modernizing the informal economy, making it more competitive, is one of the ways that you can go through that. And so that has been the experience that we've done in Central America. We also worked it in other places, as I said, in the Caucasus. I personally like to work only in small countries because nobody cares about them. Everybody talks about Brazil, etc., etc., and nobody really looks into the tiny little pieces that exist all over the world. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions and comments on that. But before going to that, we will ask Jakob to comment, please.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. Thank you very much, Manuel. It was really, really interesting coming to Europe here and to Denmark and give us this kind of fresh air from over there, and so thank you very much for that. My name is Jakob Rokel Jacobsen. I'm working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on different issues, migration and development. One of them, and I see some colleagues here, if there are some questions I can't answer, or they might have good questions for you as well, Manuel. But as said, it's really it's good, and I think it's a really good opportunity here after the pandemic, and also very much the unfortunate, of course, Ukraine crisis, to be here also and taking time to look at these issues. as like was said, it's something that we've been discussing for 20 years at least. And of course, we are at a new stage today here in Denmark when we talk about migration and development than we were back in 2002. And I don't want to spend much time to talk about the Danish development policy. I know most of us in this room, so just very briefly, a little bit about the framework that we work with here. And then secondly, try to link up to your experience from mostly Latin America to see if there are some lessons learned that we can use going forward. So just very briefly about our relatively new development policy from last year. Very much you can see being developed also with a perspective on focusing on migration, fragile context, working more closely to crisis as one of the two areas, and the second area being climate. See if I can make this thing work. Being climate change. That's the second one. Sorry, wait a second. There you go. So just first a few words about the development policy. Big focus on migration, fragile context. Out of the 17 billion of approximately Danish development assistance, we will spend more on these areas up to 2025. We will increase the volume with 3.5 billion Danish kroner. So quite a lot of focus on where migration is a major part of that new increase. There are some policy statements in our relatively new development policy that kind of reflects a little bit of what you're dealing with here. You know, we will help prevent we will use development cooperation to prevent inequality, poverty, displacement, irregular migration. So that's, you know, one of the policy statements. We want to fight that, help more people along key migration routes, and we want to work for a new, just and humane asylum system. So those are kind of the, you know, one of the areas that we take as a point of departure. And you can say we're also getting closer to work on root causes, also as also DIIS mentioned in the recent paper, root causes of irregular migration. Sometimes it's not the best, maybe not the best wording, maybe it's better to look at drivers. And you can say working with DIIS has also helped us, kind of is helping us. So it's a good partnership to kind of getting more informed about what we do. I think in the most recent paper that I think DIIS shared it along with the invitation to this seminar, also comes closer in helping us understanding, you know, that this is a very complex issue about what makes people move. It's not a simple relation, and sometimes also when you look at the development strategy, maybe some people will start thinking that, you know, some of the relations between poverty and migration are more simple as they are. And being much more context specific and with a lot of different drivers, it's something where you really need to look into and have a very deep analysis of the area. So that might be, you can say, one of the first questions you can say that I think would be really interesting for us, because we don't work, not a lot, at least in Latin America, but looking at your experiences here in this project here, and then trying to bring it into our, you could say, our work of getting forward. Because of course one thing is working along migration routes, another one is a track on readmission, but the other one is kind of regularizing and looking at the root causes in the poorest countries. Probably some of the countries where we are working are more fragile than some of the countries where you have your experience from. Some state functions are probably not working. Maybe the financial market is not as good as you have here. You know, so how are you, and we even have countries, we just talked with a colleague here, Afghanistan is a big issue now. You can't even send money to the country anymore. You know, the country is failing. We also see difficulties in a lot of Sahel, which is also a big focus area. Ethiopia also becoming more and more difficult. So basically, we are entering now a period with a strategy where we're really, I would say, you know, it's really difficult to work on a lot of these issues here, and we are also, you know, I know there might be experiences from Honduras that I know is a very violent country and also very, very difficult to work in Honduras, for instance. But working in Mali these days and trying to help Mali set up a social security system and help advance cash payments to the most vulnerable is difficult when the World Bank can't work in Mali today. You know, their kind of clauses says that with a military coup, they're not able to help setting up a social protection system anymore. So that's kind of one area that I think, you know, it's really interesting seeing, you know, what can we take forward from the experiences you have here in where we are still digging into these very, you know, challenging environments. I know it's challenging here, I guess. So that's one thing. I somehow also like this idea about creating hope and the Biden idea of creating hope, that even how vulnerable and even how difficult it is, there must always be a chance to create hope. To see if you have some good kind of, you know, good advice on that one, how we in some of our programs can integrate that so it's not just a very desperate work we have. We're also looking at a track maybe inspired by some of the work in ECOWAS, where ECOWAS has tried to mobilize, fund some of the very, you could say, the very positive aspects of having migrants flow over the Sahel region. You know, that's also, I think, some programs under ECOWAS that can be used for inspiration for what we can do in other places. So some really interesting stuff there. One thing also on remittances, and I you know, it's not something that I'm following, but I'm surprised to see. It's really interesting to see that even during the pandemic, that it maintained such a high level and such an importance, even when it has been so difficult to travel. Looking also at Ukraine crisis today and in Moldova, is really highly dependent on remittances. If you have any, you know, would also be interesting to see, you know, I'm pretty sure we will be working more with Moldova. So if you have any insights on Moldova, could also be, you know, be interesting to hear something on that one. So I'm sorry, it's a lot of, you know, it was a very inspirational talk you had. So thank you very much. And over to you.
Thank you, Jakob. Manuel, I think you should have a chance to reply to some of these questions.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I think definitely the issue of fragile states is perhaps the most challenging problem at this point in time, because the number of fragile states since 2009 has been increasing. And the fragile countries, the problems happening within fragile countries have become even more dense. So my particular experience with Latin America brings me to at least three main countries: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, where state fragility has gotten in very complicated terms. Fragility in this case is not always related to state failure like Haiti, where you're basically dealing with a failed state. So there is no functioning government in place in a failed state. In a fragile state, you don't have to get to be a failed state, but you're not functioning properly. So in the three countries, you have major problems, serious economic growth problems, partly because these are models of economic growth that are very skewed, old-fashioned, obsolete economic growth strategies, and typically led by a few elites. You know, in the case of Cuba, you have a specific elite that has been managing the economy for more than 40 years. The case of Venezuela, there is a new elite in charge, but basically they continue the same business model. And Nicaragua is the same story. The second element is that there is a serious institutional problem in the political setting. And the root of the institutional problem is at the rule of law. There is not compliance to rule of law principles of democratic institutions. So there is a significant subversion of the basic institutions of democracy. I mentioned Nicaragua, the criminalization of democracy. The state has passed laws to deny rights of freedom of expression. If you express yourself, you go to jail. There is a law that basically accuses you of that, but it's similar to the Cuban model. And then you have another element of fragility that I think it's been somewhat euphemistic, but not very well addressed, and is that of climate change. We're only realizing how seriously the problem of climate change is with regards to migration and with regards to state fragility. Well, for example, a country like Costa Rica has gotten to an economic transformation, into a digital and economic transformation into the green economy, and is trying to adapt to the changing dynamics of living in the modern society. Other countries like Honduras are still struggling with droughts, how to switch from farming activities or how to improve agricultural production from different kinds of technologies. And that is having an effect on migration. I've been following migration patterns in several of these countries, and what is called the dry corridor area is increasingly shifting in extension, but it's also pushing people out in numbers. So the extent of fragility has become more dense in these countries, and it's having an effect on human mobility, not just labor mobility, but human mobility. So the treatment to it requires a different approach, and that approach brings the issue of hope. But the issue of hope is not just about material circumstances, but it's about understanding this millennial generation. And it may sound somewhat esoteric, but even in developing countries, you do have a new generation that feels more entitled. Even in the least democratic of societies, whether you're talking about Somalia, Mali, or Moldova, the youth, people under 30, feel more entitled as to their needs, as to what they want. And the practical example I gave you is data. But data access to most people today is ubiquitous. It's just as needed as breathing. But if you are in Bangladesh, you're struggling to breathe the air, but you're also struggling to have access to data. And so Bangladesh still is one of the poorest economies in the world, and will be as long as they don't address those issues. So understanding the needs and the wants of this generation is the fundamental aspect that can address hope. It's not just having a job, but it's in fact providing the resources to live in the knowledge and the digital economy in a green context. And that's really complex. I mean, your country, it's basically ahead of the curve in that, but you are 30 years ahead of countries like Bangladesh or Moldova or Honduras. And so what we need to find is strategies that shorten that gap, that 30-year gap of knowledge, technology, tools, and vehicles in a matter of 3 years. Because the speed at which things go is so rapid that the developments that are taking place are just going to overwhelm you and keep you lagging behind. So in my experience, the issue of hope is addressed by understanding how people feel entitled. What are the issues that give them that sense of entitlement, and how do you address them? And not being euphemistic, but gender relationships, gender equality, it's at the core of this. It's not just an issue that you have to pay lip service that women have the same rights that men, but those entitlements should be ensured to everyone. And in this day and age, the fact is that the desires of having the same entitlements by women are really strong. So there are some paradoxes that we're going through, and one of them is that in this moment in time, we're going through what I call the gender discrimination dividend. and that is that the discrimination that women went through up until the 1970s of not having access to college opportunities, and then they were offered the choice to have access, but that access was given in careers like nursing, marketing, administration. Well, today those are the careers that are the most competitive in the global economy. So, but what is not synchronized with is fair, equal pay and positions of authority. So the issue of hope is connected to these dynamics that we need to pay attention to. And then with regards to remittances, I mean, I've been working in Moldova since 2004 with the banking sector, and unfortunately, Moldova has been treated by Russia, and I'm not mean to make politics of it, but everything is political. To Russia, Moldova is just a wine farm and a labor exporter country. So, 30% of income in Moldova comes from remittances, and 30% of income comes from wine exports. And that's it. Everything else is the informal economy and rural areas produced by these the small credit associations that are scattered all over the country. And so it's a country that remains backward. The Ukrainian migration to Moldova, it's creating a long-term problem, because what we know is that once you get out, in this day and age, once you get out of a country, you are here to stay. When I looked at migration, I looked at what I call the illusion of impermanence. We migrate and we spend 5 years and we always say, I'm going back to my country. And I used to look at what we call hometown associations. Hometown associations were these groups of migrants who will raise money to help their hometown. And what was fascinating is that the core membership of the hometown associations, whether you're talking about Armenian HTAs or Guatemalan HTAs, was made of very old people and very young people. The recently migrant who arrived with the romantic attachment to their homeland, oh, I miss my country, or the very old person who says, well, if I'm not going to go back, at least I want to be buried there. So they raise money to improve the cemetery of their hometown, because that's where they want to die or to be buried. In fact, I just thinking about it, my aunt died 2 months ago, and it was a nightmare to fulfill her dream. She died in Canada, and from Canada they took the remains to Nicaragua, and it's like my entire family was so happy as when it was her birthday. But that reality has changed today, in that a person who migrates and spends more than 2 years in the host country, it's highly unlikely it will return. And this will be the case of Ukraine, in Moldova, and in other countries. Poland, I don't think that will be as much as in other places. The United States will be. And so with regards to remittances, you do have different scenarios. One is, we know it's going to be a prolonged war. The question is, will it be a prolonged war with a legitimate government or with a fake government? That, with regards to remittances, is important, because the payment networks will function depending on that type of government. If you have a legitimate government with an insurgency warfare taking place, you still will have access to the EU platform to send money. If you have a fake government, you're going to have a different type of informal sending methods, like the old-fashioned hawala. Well, not that old-fashioned, but like the hawala system, that you clear funds through trade, because the most important necessity will be providing supplies to your relatives, not money. And the new trend, which is not that new, will be cryptocurrency. I'm a very conservative guy when it comes to money, but crypto will be important in the context of an unstable economy that is controlled by a foreign power, because you will be able to, because of the autonomous mechanisms of blockchain technology, they can operate in their own financial ecosystems, parallel to whatever Russia wants to establish. in a country like Ukraine. So you will have different dynamics going on there.
Thank you. Let me see if did I unmute? Yes, right. We have, I think, a very good base for a interesting discussion here, and some tensions maybe also in perspectives. I always ask myself the question whether development cooperation should be used to prevent migration, irregular migration, from particular places, or whether development cooperation practitioners should be more aware of the way you could use migration to create development. So it's two very different ways of linking people's mobility and both human and economic development all over the world. And I think I've heard in both of your talks also this basic question that we can take up. The other issue that I also find really interesting, especially listening to your analysis, Manuel, is, I mean, the whole question of remittances, who remits and for which reasons. And you said that those who stay for more than 2 years are highly unlikely to return. And I think, can we at all understand this without taking changes in global migration policy into the equation? I mean, when I started working with Latin American migrants in the United States in the 1990s, people were also irregular migrants, but the chance of regularizing was high. It took 3, 4, 5 years maximum, then you became a regular migrant and you could travel back and forth. And that's what people did. And many people lived the time in their home countries, and when they needed extra capital, they went to New York, to Miami, to Los Angeles to work for a couple of months to finance that particular need. The issue that is no longer possible, of course, makes irregular people more permanent. We have studied it with Somalis in Denmark. We have looked at who returns, those who have obtained Danish citizenship, because the rest wouldn't risk losing the chance of getting back should it not be possible to create a new existence. So these are very fundamental questions when we think about what kind of development interventions we can design to mitigate, as you write in your abstract, these questions. But I will have time to discuss that, and I think about this all the time. So I would rather give you a chance to engage in this dialogue, ask questions, or comment on what you've heard. So the floor is open, and we have half an hour. We start in the back, and you should wait for the mic, and then next up here. Okay, we start here.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. It's very useful. My name's Ian Wilkinson, and I work here in Copenhagen, and I'm a migrant myself. And I identify with the Nicaraguans who like the coffee, because I bring back Marmite every time I go back to England. But my question is more about, we see these initiatives and how we can control, or not control, how we can address the drivers for this migration. And there's an awful lot of money that goes into it. And of course, the elephant in the room then becomes the corruption in countries at local and national levels. So in your experience of working particularly in Central America, where have you seen real and tangible improvement in addressing the issue of corruption in officials? 10 hospitals in a country that's probably received millions of dollars in aid doesn't speak very well for the people who are trusted in spending that money. And that's a huge problem when we try and address these drivers, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Wolfgang Mostert, and I would like to go into what you spoke about remittances and also blockchain technology. Because one thing is that you have remittances person to person, which of course are very valuable contributions to purchasing power and decreasing poverty in the country. But do you have any organized attempts to see whether you could organize money from the diaspora via platforms and blockchain integrated loops to directly productive investments? For example, think about Haiti, which, as you know, is a totally failed state. If you want to invest in the rural areas where only 4% of access to electricity, you would have to think in terms of mini-grid investments. And this could be organized in theory from money from the Haitian diaspora in the United States, if you could organize a system whereby you have an integrated blockchain all the way from the money to the investments, to the people who pay and the repayment. Do you know of any initiatives of this kind of making use of blockchain technology to direct remittances to directly productive purposes?
Well, on the issue of corruption, this is a problem that has become more complex because of the different aspects to it. My approach with regards to Central American countries, Latin America in general, is to focus on the demand side rather than on the supply. Most of development assistance has focused on providing support to governments to strengthen their transparency mechanisms, their procurement systems, their technology. In my experience, you need to tackle the demand side by addressing financial integrity. Fiscal and financial integrity procedures can actually make corruption less likely. And the point of departure is ensuring that any cash transaction that takes place goes directly through the financial sector, because automatically, because of technology, it is recorded, it is supported with documentation as to the source, the origin of the transaction. And so I think that has been an area that I have seen that works. You know, with regards to migration in general and remitting, you have different realities. The diaspora sometimes gets involved in corruption activities because political favors are the flavor of attractiveness in a diaspora. It satisfies your ego. You know, to provide a donation to Ghana, for example, in Accra, for better cemetery companies, you donate $10,000, but in return you want something attractive to you. And that becomes, that favor, when is perpetuated over time, creates a vicious cycle that is not very, that becomes toxic. And we've seen it in all of the diasporas happening. That's a different issue, but it does relate to corruption, because the diaspora is aware that when financial integrity is not present, you can go around in circles and circumvent the clientelistic and circumvent the institutional system by taking advantage of the clientelistic system. So the way to tackle clientelism is through financial integrity. There are lots of models on blockchain technology that you can actually motivate migrants to invest in a given activity. The issue is more, however, not the technology, but the skill and the knowledge of the diaspora, for example, of a migrant community to understand what is most important to invest on in whether it's Haiti or another country, because most people in the diaspora do not have expertise on development. They think they do because they live through the experience of underdevelopment, but that is not substitute. You know, there are certain skills and tools that you need to have to promote development, and most of them lack it. So it's not the technology itself that is going to address it, but there are experiences. I mean, and you know, the most interesting case right now is El Salvador. Is the country in the world that adopted cryptocurrency as the legal tender in that country, and people don't use it. El Salvador received $7 billion in remittances last year. Only 60 million came from cryptocurrency, less than 1%. And that's because they still don't find the use to it, the purpose, the investment to it, because it's costly too. Now, you can develop the technology, and the way to do it is first developing the financial infrastructure to have opportunities for everyone to have access to financial resources. The second level approach is to develop a digital community. That digital community can be composed of the ecosystem of remittance recipients, the financial institutions providing the payments, and through that you develop the blockchain technology that then can provide digital currency supported by that community. But that takes a lot of work that needs to be developed with a very advanced set of tools, and we're still not there yet. I mean, I'll be happy to say, oh, blockchain technology is sexy, let's go for it. But no, it's not yet. But it's something that is going to happen. You know, the same way that the cell phone payments, we were saying 10 years ago, it's not going to happen. Well, it will happen, and it did happen. The increase in remittances, for example, is connected to the use of digital platforms, because when people use digital platforms over cash, they tend to send more money in quantity and in frequency. Why? Behavior economics. When we have a more control of the money, we actually quantify it better, and then we make better calculations as to the use of it. You also tend to increase our disposable income when the money is in the digital wallet than when it is in your physical wallet. And we don't detest 15% more. People have 15% more disposable income when they have bank accounts than when they don't.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is sorry. My name is Eric Toft. Very interesting to hear the experiences from Latin America, which I don't know much about. But I noticed one of your first detailed tables included some health parameters, like how many were vaccinated, and there was a global health index. And I wonder if that is because the economic situation, the income per capita, for example, might not explain fully why people are migrating, because in this institute and other places there have been studies showing that what Denmark is trying to do, Denmark is trying to, we have a special tool for trying to make sure we don't get too many migrants to Denmark, and so we want to develop the countries, the economies, and so on. My take on that, and studies from this institute, is that, well, the better off people are in Africa and places like that, then they can actually afford to come to Europe. They might be too poor to travel. You said it costed $4,000 to $5,000 to get out of some of these countries. I guess that means actually to get to the US, but that might be cheap compared to what it costs to get from some African countries. So to me, there's this not a direct correlation, but the richer you get to a certain limit, then you will actually come to Europe. But since you were putting forward these health data. Is that were you trying to find another explanation, reason for why people were leaving? Thank you.
And we have one more question up here, the gentleman in the blue jacket.
Hello. I'd like to ask Manuel to comment on the example that Jakob gave of development policy in Danish development policy. The example is, as far as I remember, the development of social security. The development of social security provision in Mali. My question is, does that constitute assistance in the way that Manuel recommends, which emphasizes productivity of labor? The thinking behind that is that it's all very well for Denmark to help Social Security because it sells well in Denmark. This is a very nice thing. You know, we believe in Social Security, we believe in helping poor farmers and so on and so forth, but if we help poor farmers, that's not the kind of assistance that Manuel thinks is the most productive, most helpful for the economy. Is that right? Would you comment on the goals of assistance with social security provision in Mali from the point of view of productivity in the local economy? That's the question.
We will give Jakob a chance to comment as well.
Maybe I'll try to comment, because I think it's the issue of social protection is also really interesting in terms of when you look at migration and migration pattern. And I think I think social protection is part of the framework, and it was also actually mentioned in the recent DIIS strategy, like a package where social protection is included is something that can make people who can't make a living for maybe, you know, in the lean season or other seasons where agricultural productivity is going down. It's building a system that can, you know, hold the hand over the poorest and most vulnerable people that would otherwise have to migrate in a system when they could not make an earning out of their daily work. So I think that's the kind of very simplistic kind of work that combining social protection systems with maybe changing crop to more climate smart agriculture could be kind of a combination of a fuller package that could enable people to actually stay in where they are and make a living, so they don't have to leave, because otherwise, you know, they will simply die if they cannot grow the crops they used to. So the examples from, for instance, from Mali is one where you will take meteorological data, and then you will send cash maybe 6 months at a time when you know that there will be a drought, and you will not be able to manage 6 months period unless you have extra cash at hand. So I think that was kind of the idea, having that in a combination maybe with other different productivity, labor kind of working schemes is the rationale behind that. Over to you.
Manuel, please.
Yes, I think that in my perspective, the focus is on labor productivity, and in the global economy, labor productivity means green economy, digital economy, and knowledge economy. So in order to ensure that social protection systems exist, you need to calibrate these three factors in a way that there is prosperity in a society. If your society is working under very underdeveloped farming infrastructures, and it's solely focused on that, it will not have a reliable social protection system. So economic complexity is at the core of prosperity. And economic complexity today is connected to a green economy that is modernized. It's connected to a much more advanced formal economy focused on the knowledge economy, on the knowledge markets. And it's also an economy that is more competitive. So, I mean, in my experience, the focus on farming, it's incomplete. You have to extend beyond that by modernizing your local economy, getting them into the knowledge economy, the digital economy. Digitizing an economy is not just financial activities, but delivery, processing of resources. The so-called supply chain today, it's all about digital transfers where there is delivery on time. So, social protection depends on these three elements: the digital, the green, and the knowledge economies. On your question, I mean, from an academic standpoint, using per capita income is an inadequate methodological tool to talk about economics. You need to look at the more complex elements that today make economic decisions, and behavior economics is one important component. How do we make choices about working in certain activities, but also working in the informal economy, for example? That in itself is not, it is a more robust indicator of wealth than per capita income. And a very good example is Bangladesh. Bangladesh economic growth shows 6% growth year on year because of the maquila sector, the outsourcing economy. But it's a country of 100 million people where only 3 million people are working in that sector. So they pump up average income. You also have 6 million workers sending money to relatives, but the ones who don't receive money are not in a good shape, and that's 2/3 of the society. So you have to look at economic indicators that are more realistic. And the reason why I've been looking at the state fragility indicators, it's because migration has been more correlated to that. And within the context of fragility, you have health indicators. The pandemic raised basically a red flag that was already underlying. The social safety networks were in all developing countries in pretty bad shape. Access to health services was really mediocre. When the pandemic came out, what it did is just to resurface that. And what it did, in fact, was to heighten the anxieties of postponed social protest that was boiling in since 2018. This year, we're going to see a lot of social upheavals taking place in several developing countries because their satisfactions hasn't been realized, and a lot of them has to do with the quality of the healthcare system. But the quality of the healthcare system is a function and a byproduct of a poorly established social protection system, which is based on, no contribution, no tax contributions. And on the one hand, from the average population, but also a poorly integrated country in the global economy. So you have to look at more than one single indicator. Per capita income is still not good enough of an indicator. I use it only to measure the effect on the informal economy, and then looked at how, for example, those households in an informal economy were more affected and how that correlates to migration.
Are there more questions in the audience? We have one. We have two.
Hello, my name is Lasse Heinet, and I would like to ask you, Manuel, what do you think about economical sanctions as a foreign policy tool in terms of developing or not developing a certain country? Let's say, for instance, Syria, when thinking about Danish foreign policy, or it could be Cuba, speaking of American foreign policy in terms of prohibiting or preventing people from migrating and moving. So my question is, does economical sanctions where you cannot transfer money to banks in the specific country, does or will that work as a tool for foreign policy?
Thank you. Let's take
Yes, thank you. My name is Serena. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And thank you, first of all, Manuel, very much for an interesting and informative presentation. I was just wondering, as you may know, the Danish government has an ambition to move the asylum procedure to a country outside of the EU as part of a larger vision for a more humane and fair asylum system. And I was just, so the thought behind this idea is to try to address some of the incentives for irregular migration and to try to prevent this by externalizing the asylum procedure. A bit like the model that we've seen in Australia and also in Guatemala with the agreement with the United States. So I was just wondering what's your how do you see this? Do you think that there's an that this will address the incentives, and do you think that we'll see a prevention of irregular migration by doing this? Thank you.
Can I add to that, because I saw that the special task force was here, and I was also thinking, I mean, if we talk about remittances and how to make remittances work better for development, taking into account that remittances are private funds that is sent from family members to other family members, basically, are there ways in which we could see that remittances could not only prevent some family members from following other migrants, but actually to stay and use the money sent back for productive purposes locally, instead of simply financing more migration, where the logic for many migrants would be that until my entire family is here, I will have to send remittances the rest of my life. So the only way I can get a profit for myself is not to have to send it, right? But are there ways that we can think of making that work on the one hand? And the other thing is, I mean, that's the case for the United States, but also for Europe, that we deport a lot of irregular migrants or not accepted asylum seekers who fail in the procedure. So are there ways in which we could think sort of this remittance circle into that, or should we rather not at all try to do that?
I think, you know, the model that I introduced is one way, successful method to tie remittances with development, in the sense that when you formalize these savings at scale, you can mobilize them into credit in strategic sectors of an economy. We also know that people who receive remittances are likely to migrate, but we know that people who own bank accounts and own real estate are less likely to migrate. So the moment you formalize remittance savings from remittance recipients, you make migration less likely. And that has been our experience in several of these countries. So that model is important because it builds into an ecosystem of development. Because you're not only focusing on the family, but you're using basically those foreign savings to fund productivity in the society, and in turn make that society more competitive so that people do not have to opt out from the system. And so that's a proven experience. And it doesn't go, it respects the privacy of the person-to-person funds. You're just simply leveraging on money that has been deposited into a bank account, in the same way that we all, you know, put our money in a bank account and the banks chooses to put it to work elsewhere into credit. So that's really possible, and that's a strategy. On the experience on asylum procedures, the migration protocols, I think it's not going to work if what you want is to, apply the tool that, the longer they wait, they decide to return. The majority of people that migrate, that they have already invested their resources and their decision to move from the country where they are. And if they go through the asylum process, it's because they have most likely a legitimate claim. The problem is that, in the United States right now is 40% approval rate. It used to be 30%. And so the ones who are denied actually end up staying irregularly during an extended period of time. The migration protocols may lengthen that process, but people are not returning. And we'll see the experience in the United States. Mexico has become a complicated problem, hosting refugees from Latin America, not just from Central America. They're struggling to handle the cases, but if the rules are the same, the approval rate will continue to be the same. So, whether you wait 10 months or 6 months in country, to me, that labor force that comes to work to the US economy will be contributing back home than waiting those 9 months to hear their case in a foreign country. Now, of course, that provided that you connect this strategy of leveraging remittances. I think if you don't leverage them, you perpetuate the vicious circle. And this is one of the things we're trying to break with the Biden administration's root causes of migration strategy, because I think it's incomplete. And on the question on sanctions, look, I focus my work on my 3 Ps: precision, purpose, and proportionality. And sanctions make that rule. The purpose of sanctions, or economic sanctions in foreign policy, are basically a way to address the lack of due process in a country, the problem of accountability in a society, in a dictatorship like Cuba. In the lack of accountability, sanctions try to correct, exact some fairness into the system that is denying justice to a society. So sanctions do have a purpose, and is that to correct, to exact justice in a given context. Of course, the other intended purpose, secondary one, is being misused more and more, which is to modify behavior by increasing sanctions in a given country, because this is the paradox, and Ukraine is a very good example, because as we have moved in the past 20 years or the past 30 years, I mean, the last time we had an interstate war was 30 or 40 years ago. Perhaps Armenia, Azerbaijan is one example. Ethiopia, Eritrea is another example, but you don't really have a foreign power invading another since the 1980s in large scale. And we had moved away from the use of force as a global society. And now that we only have tools of like economic sanctions, we feel that there is not a proportional response to the problem. So unfortunately, we have been returned to the Cold War and rethink the use of force perhaps as a proportional measure. And this is a tough context in the postmodern society, because we are not willing to do it. So what do you have in addition to economic sanctions that is not the use of force as a way to nudge and push a country away from the use of violence? And this is the critical juncture that we are dealing right now with Russia. And likely you're going to have a mixed effect, that there will be external powers getting involved European countries will participate in this war, and the conflict will also be dealing with other forms of pressure, societal pressure, digital digital warfare. It's going to be one of the most important tools of war. So to answer your question, we're dealing with a disproportional issue, and countries are using sanctions as a way to deal with the problem of proportionality, and it's not having the expected effect. So Cuba, for example, has had serious problems with remittances because of the sanction regime on that country by the United States. And instead it had a backfiring effect. So one has to find an alternative. The government, I'm actually in a task force with the Cuban government with regards to remittances to Cuba to circumvent FinCEMIX, which is the institution that has been sanctioned, and use digital transfers through other systems like the mail, the post office.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you, Jakob. Thank you, audience, for interesting question. I think we've had a very enlightening afternoon on very important issues regarding the current state of affairs with migration, development, and remittances. So thank you for coming, and should we give Manuel a hand? Please stay.